Welcome back to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris here again with Wayne Stender, and we're talking about my most recent conversation on the podcast. This was with Sean McDowell about his excellent new book, A Rebel's Manifesto. This was really a guide directed at teenagers and young adults, those who are entering this tumultuous and confusing cultural time, and it's a call to rebellion against the principles and the pressures of this age, and it goes through topic after topic after topic. Sean and I were able to cover a good number of them, as well as the main theme of the book. And I thought it was a really good and helpful discussion. I hope that my listeners get the book. But Wayne, you have some additional questions about this, so let's do the further upstream thing. Let's talk a little bit more about that conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. I have a lot of questions on this, and I hope they're not just coming across as playing devil's advocate or challenging Sean, who's not here, and I'm just gonna now pick on him. But I really do want to know some of these questions specifically related to his title of the book and how we titled the episode on how to raise a rebel is how we titled the episode. And I was a little bit challenged by that because as Christians, I think there's a natural maybe posture that we have that doesn't really appreciate rebellion. We, especially, I think, kind of inside of the church or understanding Christ or understanding culture, there's a love or an appreciation for falling underneath the authority. Like we become church members to fall underneath the authority of the church in many cases. We fall underneath the authority of Scripture. And so when Sean was talking about, being a rebel, I understood it kind of like in that attitude of being like rebelling against the culture. But I was a little bit hesitant to say, I buy into that, because some of the muscles I think it takes for you to be a rebel, there's exercises, there's practices, there's a way of looking at the world that seems to be always questioning and never maybe understanding or falling underneath the authority or leadership of something. And so maybe to start off, you could give me a perspective on the muscles or the habits or the practices in having a posture of rebelling against the culture that we should pull out. And as Christians, it is natural for us to have that attitude or that characteristic.
Yeah, the danger in, the language of rebellion, the sentiments and drives that lead to rebellion, is that you're going to become a contrarian. Like you're going to become someone who just reflexively reacts against what it is that's the dominant idea or authority structure in your family or your church or your society or what have you. And at that point, you're just a hipster, right? In the best case scenario, you're a hipster. Worst case scenario, you're some kind of futile revolutionary. And so in that sense, I get what you're saying. I think there's an element of popular appeal to teenage instincts that are happening here. Teenagers are known for being rebellious, right? And Sean's call throughout the book, explicitly and implicitly, is sort of, hey, if you're gonna rebel, because I know you're gonna, then rebel against the thing that's really in charge of your and your peer group's lives right now, which is this set of cultural expectations and this script that drives you to believe and think certain things without examining them. Okay, like actually deal with that thing instead of your poor parents who are trying their level best to, hold their own against this culture. But there's an even deeper element to it than that, Wayne. And it goes back to, I'm going to bring in Jordan Peterson because, why not?
Because why not? Because we always need
Because
to.
Why not? Yeah. So he, in his second popular book, it's called Beyond Order. And you're like, well, what's that mean? He's sort of a conservative figure. Conservatives like order and law and all that. Why are we getting beyond order? Well, he believes, and I think he's right, that there are opposite errors. There's an anarchistic tendency morally and personally and psychologically, but then there's a tyrannical tendency. So when an order has become tyrannical, that order inevitably creates its own overthrow. It fosters that desire to overthrow it. And if it doesn't, then it'll just crumble. Beyond Order is sort of an examination of what does it look like when order breaks down or when it needs to be broken down in order to produce a restoration, a restored synthesis or order, or what have you. And the example he goes to right away in the book is Jesus. He says Jesus enters the picture in the Gospels as this thunderbolt of revolution that is calling not for something new and unprecedented, but a return to God's precepts and to faith in Yahweh and to generosity and love for your fellow Israelites and for adherence to the Mosaic covenant, right? Jesus does not come along as a figure that says, I'm throwing away the past. He says, what you guys have done is you become a corrupted order. And so Jesus says, I'm here to represent the spirit of the law, the thing it was really all about from the very beginning. And I'm going to restore that order over and against your tyrannical, Pharisaical, Sadduceical order that's built up a bunch of accretions of unnecessary rules around God's real law. And he understands that is the correct reading of Jesus. That is what he actually did. And in that sense only, was he a revolutionary? You could even describe him as a rebel. He's a rebel against a false tyrannical order that's come to dominate his time. And that is what Sean is calling us to be in many ways, a rebel against a false tyrannical and destructive order that has run its course and has proven itself a life destroyer.
Yeah. So looking at that, I think maybe my challenge a little bit with this is maybe a matter of perspective, that when you're inside of maybe kind of the establishment or whatever, you're looking at the people that are rebelling or that are changing something as rebels. And when you're on the other side, you see them maybe as reformers. And maybe help me understand that a little bit, the necessary aspects of that, because I got the impression really from Sean that he does really want to build in foundational thoughts for his kids, not just to rebel against the culture, but to say that there's something that's beautiful inside of, what's causing them to rebel, if that makes sense. We just did a break point a little bit on this topic where Glenn Sunshine talked about the need for a culture revolutionary to understand the culture and not just to revolt against it, right? That when we look at Christian movements inside of history, and I would even say maybe the Reformation would be a good example, because to those that are reformed, we would look at what Luther did and said, oh, he was reforming because he understood the ground roots of being inside of the church. And then on the other side, you're kind of looking at it, if you're from a Catholic side, you might be looking at it and saying, well, he was just rebelling against an order that was already going to maybe change. And it's all the North-South issue too, and you're going to run into the Civil War. I mean, it's all a matter of perspective. But I got the impression too from Sean that it's not that we're rebelling and like running away from the culture, but I think he's calling youth to be a part of it. So what are the things inside of this culture that you think that we need to understand as kind of a foundation? Is there a foundation for us to build, rather than just saying, I'm rebelling against you, and I'm going to, my 5-year-old, when he rebels against me, he's going to pack up his knapsack and walk down the street because he's moving out, right? He's going to start his own existence. I don't get the impression that's what Sean's calling us to. So help me understand that a little bit. What's the difference between rebellion and reformation there from your side?
Yeah, I think early in the book, he calls young people to consider what it means to be a good person, because he recognizes, as we discussed, that this generation is especially concerned with that question of justice, real justice, and being a good person who advocates justice. And even the worst of the younger generation, the most, facile of them, are still concerned with looking as if they care about that. It's a fashionable thing. This is not an age in which the younger generation is saying, oh, whatever floats your boat, just do it. Whatever, gives you thrills and makes you happy, just do it. I mean, there's a sense in which that's true. There is a licentiousness and a permissiveness, but it's overridden, I think, by this overwhelming call to justice. And so you ask yourself, what's really motivating the LGBTQZXY movement? What's behind that? Is it a moral permissiveness that says everyone should just be able to do what they want? Or is it a call that's rooted in a misguided sense of justice that says everyone should be allowed to be who they are just in the same way that, racial minorities are who they are, because that's the narrative that gets drawn forth. It's like, we need to give these people justice of full inclusion, recognition, and equality in society. Same kind of language is used. So it's a moral appeal that's being made. And I think when you understand that, you get the sense in which Sean is calling for a reformation and not a revolution, not an anything goes revolution, because he has his finger on the pulse of this generation, and he realizes that what they care about at some fundamental level being good people. And so he wants to challenge them. Well, what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to love someone? And he brings up that I think he refers back to it, as Christine Imba has a couple of times in the New York Times recently, to Thomas Aquinas' definition of love, to will the good of another. And that's so crucial to grasp that, because to love someone does not mean I want what they want. I want them to be able to self-actualize. I want them to get whatever they demand at any given moment and be able to follow any impulse. That's not how you love a child. That's not how you love a spouse. That's not how you love, a neighbor, a member of your church. That everyone at some point makes the mistake of believing that what they want is actually good for them when it's bad for them. Or if you say, I have strong feelings, as Imbo would say, I have strong feelings for this person, or I just have a strong sexual attraction to them, and I want to have a consensual, casual encounter. And that's free love. No, it's not. There's no love there, because you don't care what happens to that person. You're not pursuing their ultimate good and thriving. You're just using them as an object for your pleasure. And they're doing the same thing to you. So it's like mutual debasement. I think that's the core question that Sean would say we need to ask, is what actually is love? What actually does it mean to be a good person in that regard? And there's some extent to which I'm mixing up this book with his previous book that I had him on about, because I think they do flow together. And that was called Chasing Love. And he really investigates this issue of what actually is love. What does it mean? If we want to pursue that, then we have to understand the answer to that question. We can't just arbitrarily, make things up. And so I think that's a broad framework of what he's doing in this book and the appeal he's making, and why it's not a cry for, the impulse of this generation is not to demand moral anarchy. It's to demand a moral order, but it's a misguided moral order. And Sean is calling us to rebel against that.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask and push you on that a little bit? Would you say that it's a misguided moral order, or is it an underdeveloped moral order that maybe this generation hasn't fully come in? Because I do sense through Sean's books, which have been, incredibly helpful, that there's this aspiration, especially in Gen Z, and I would even say maybe a little bit also in Gen X, of seeking love, that there is this, it's rooted inside of us. And there's this 1 Corinthians 13 that just kind of hits me, that love is patient, love is kind. I think you could run through 1 Corinthians 13 almost with for sure with Gen Z, and they would say, absolutely, yes. And they would identify that, right? Like, okay, I'm all for those things. But at the same time, they're maybe immature in their understanding of it and their practice of it, where my 5-year-old has an immaturity of expressing, maybe his love towards me as a dad, whereas my 15-year-old has a much more mature understanding of what it means to love me as a father, that their presentations of love are different. Because I got this also, though, from Sean's book, that our calling is really to walk alongside this generation, not to say, you are wrong, and here is now the right way. Does that make sense? Can you give me a perspective on that? What is that look like to join this generation in this, that we are underdeveloped in our sense of love? Am I on the right track there? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think you are. To be underdeveloped in your sense of love means not to understand what love actually means. So you believe these things as platitudes, and the 1 Corinthians 13 attributes sound very agreeable, even to your average person in this culture. And I would say it's because they don't understand, they haven't thought through the implications of what this virtue of agape, the chief of all the virtues, and its corollaries that Paul lists, or the ways it manifests itself in the world, what that looks like. I just got through an interview with Trevin Wax on his new book, his new annotated guide to G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. And in Orthodoxy, Chesterton makes this remark that the modern era, again, he's writing 100 years ago, but it's very applicable still today, is not so much an evil age as an age of separated and wild virtues. It's too good in many ways, is what he says. And he says that the Christian virtues, the old Christian virtues that used to be united in this whole tapestry of moral vision, have been sundered from one another and are now running around setting themselves up as idols and becoming obsessions or ideologies for people. And they're separated out from one another. So, when love becomes divorced from truth, and C.S. Lewis made this point too, it becomes a hideous thing. Even mother love becomes hideous when it's divorced from truth and goodness, when it doesn't have regard for how human beings are really made, what our purpose is, how our bodies work, what our souls need, what our moral problem is in the world. Love then becomes something less than love. It becomes sub-love. It becomes, in many ways, a vice. And I think that, when I look at the wholeness of the virtues, that all the virtues must be held together lest they become monstrous. I think of God himself, and I think of the attributes of God, where we talk about the attributes of God as a tool in pedagogy, right? It's like God is justice, omnipotence, transcendence. There's the communicable and the incommunicable attributes. And we can just go on list all these attributes of God. But these aren't, in classical theism, these aren't parts of God. These aren't little sections you could parcel out and say, okay, here's God's holiness. I got it right here. That's not how it works. All of God is holy, and God is all holy. All of God is love, and God is all love. And each of these attributes is a description of the one simple being of God. And I think that's true of morality or virtue as well. All the virtue, we can piece out the virtues and be like, here's love, here's kindness, here's self-control, any way you want to list them, classical virtues, biblical virtues. But ultimately, they're all the same thing. They're all a piece of holiness or righteousness or goodness, as we would say. And if you parcel them out like that and then set one up on a throne and say, that's the king of all the virtues, it will immediately turn into a twisted and evil thing. And I think that's what you see in our age. Well, this is one of the points Carl Trueman makes. And I wrote a review of his latest book for the Gospel Coalition. And I draw this out, that in many ways, the transgender activist, to use just one example, is not animated by a desire to do what that person consciously believes is evil or destructive or, moral anarchy. That person's motivated by a desire to do something they're convinced is just and right. They think they are liberating people who have been denied the right to be who they really are and have been discriminated against and hated because of that. And so that's where the moral fervor comes from. But that's just one virtue that's been isolated out from all the others and is now running amok, destroying the fabric of society and gender and reality. And that's because it's not meant to be alone. It's meant to be together with all the other virtues, including the realization that God created us male and female, which is, part of the virtue of truth. So I see that as a much more helpful way of understanding the temperature of the time in which we live than just saying, oh, all these people are morally anarchistic and they don't care about being good people. No, they do care about being good people. They just don't know what good is.
Yeah, that is so incredibly helpful, I feel like, because especially I got hung up when you were talking about that idea of God isn't just the attributes, but that God is love. And when we understand that as believers, I think that's just part of maturing and growing into it. Like, for my kids, they call me dad. But as they grow up, that starts to become more embodied. Like, no, dad is not an attribute that man has. That man embodies being dad to me. Like all the ideas of dad that I have, God as father, whatever, are embodied in that. And so I want to ask this last question of you, because that idea sprung this next thought as, we look at this generation and we want to pull them out. And I thought you did a good job of this in the interview. We almost want to just kind of ascribe an identity to them. And so we list them based on attributes so that we can put them into a box and then we can understand them.
And they're all negative, like Sean said.
Yeah. Yeah. They're all negative. And to be honest, if I look in the mirror, I'm probably going to list a bunch of attributes where I'm like
tall, handsome, punctual.
Not exactly what I was thinking, but I tell my kids I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror. It's the first start of the day that I have because I'm like, whoa, what happened overnight? You got a lot uglier. Like there's just a reality when you see yourself in the mirror in the morning that you're like, I did not put myself together before this happened. But there's also a reality, though, that I look at myself and say, oh, your ears are big, or, we ascribe these identity things to each other. But I think there's something also, though, about embodying that, like living into the fact that I have big ears, or living into the fact, this is really weird, but I'm just trying to get to this point of, I think that for us in our place in culture, we want to stand back outside of culture and direct kids in culture that you're doing it wrong. Like, move, like, let me fix this for you. This is how you love well. And I think there's a different approach that I felt like Sean was getting to, where we're called to walk alongside and almost kind of be an embodiment of what culture is. And I think we look at culture as this like monstrosity, this big monster. We say, man, culture is something to avoid. And then I think, well, Christians actually build culture. So maybe if I embody this, idea of love, or maybe if I embody this idea of how to use social media healthy with my kid, or these things well, that we can kind of guide students together. So I see it from that standpoint. Then I also have this, you're doing some incredible counseling here. I feel like I should pay you. But there's this other road of like Rod Dreher, where we're kind of in this like Benedict option of we need to pull back and actually now rebuild what culture is and identity and things of that nature. And so that's a little bit where I felt like we were going, where Sean's calling us to actually embody what culture is with our kids. And I think sometimes the natural inclination is to cut things off. So I was listening to Barry Weiss's podcast today, and she had somebody on there, Johan Hari, and he talks about the need to redesign everything inside of social media because it's inherently broken how we've been using social media. And I wonder, like, is there a right way where we're as Christians, we're called to be a part of the grossness and the ugliness of culture to heal it from within? Or are we called to step back and build something up? What would you say to those kind of two ideas? And maybe there's a third way that I'm totally not even considering here. But as a parent, I wrestle with that. Do we jump into social media with our kids and live it with them? Do we have the Snapchat accounts and jump on Twitter and we like, hey, I'm following you, and we like walk through that with them? Or do we kind of say, that is not what culture is? That's what society is doing, but that's not a healthy, sustainable idea of how we're going to progress and grow in our understanding of love as a culture. Because Twitter and Facebook and Instagram have all been proven to say they actually make you angry and hate people rather than love people. So give me a perspective there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there's, I guess, two seemingly contradictory ideas, and I think they can be brought together. The first is my puzzlement back when the Benedict option came out at the whole debate that people had around that about, should we engage? Should we pull back? Should we be a light in the culture? Should we be monks preserving our own identity? And most of the people having that debate didn't actually read the book because, Rod was much more nuanced than that. But I was puzzled because to a large extent, I don't see that we have a choice about that. It seemed pretty academic to me. I mean, if you're going to pull back, where are you going to go exactly? Where are you going to live? How are you going to earn a living? What are you going to go live on a mountainside somewhere and start a little farm and try to grow your own pigs and cabbages? I don't know what the actual concrete way of not engaging to some degree with this thing we call American modern Western society. would look like. So very practically speaking, your kids are part of this world. They're going to be adults someday. You're not going to be able to hold their hand forever. And so, yeah, they're going to have to get jobs and get education and get to know people and find spouses and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not convinced that they can just sort of magically find all that in a church bubble that you've created. On the other hand, it is totally legitimate as a parent to insulate your kids from the harmful effects of this world. And I am a big advocate of not giving your kids cell phones until they are well mature and well into sort of a more young adult mindset, not stealing their childhood by letting them get on social media and being subjected to all the coarseness and pressures and ugliness and just the vile filth, in terms of whether we're talking about pornography and exploitation, all the way to like the emotional abuse and bullying that happens there. I don't want them subjected to that. I want them to have a childhood. And yes, I'm going to insulate them from that. And yes, they go to a private Christian school, a classical Christian school, because I don't want them subjected to what is taught in the public schools. So, those two things appear contradictory. I don't think they are. And the reason is because I'm raising children who will be adults someday. I'm raising children who I know will be in my shoes, possibly situations more challenging than I have faced. And I want them to be better at that than I have been in my situation. I want them to be the kind of people that I will meet someday in eternity and say, you are so much my superior. You're so much my better. You've made better moral choices than I have and grown into a much greater spiritual stature than I did. And the fact that you are honoring me still, kids, is only due to the fact that I'm your father. And that is very humbling. And it's also part of your blessedness and your goodness. And that's just how things should work, right? Children honor their fathers. But I want them to be better. I want them to be stronger. I want them to be the kind of people I could look at not being their father and admire them greatly and want to be like them. And that doesn't happen by just keeping them insulated from the ideas that are going to confront them and the pressures that are going to confront them. They have to be trained to do that. So part of that training, I think, is not taking your fuel and your lifeblood, perhaps that's a better metaphor, from the current age. We have, as Christians, and this is one of the greatest lessons you can learn as a Christian, and it's what Upstream has done in large part, is to try to put listeners, believers, in contact with the wisdom of the past, to read the old books, like Lewis said, to think the old ideas, to consult the old sages, and to recognize ideas and beliefs and dogmas and institutions that have stood the test of time. And that is what I think we have to do for our kids. There will come a day, I'm convinced, when the ideas of this culture will fail so many people that they'll they'll find the nearest Christian who was raised right and go, help us, help us recover, help us learn, help us know what's real again and rebuild civilization, rebuild sanity, help us have a family. We just want a family. We just want a community. We just want love. And we know that our definition of love doesn't work. So I think preparing kids to do that, that's the big, broad goal. And I know that's a lot of flowery language and abstract thought. And I give that fully conscious of that fact as a father. But I think we do have to get those abstracts in place as we begin to look forward and work out the specifics of how to make that happen. So if you looked at the way I raised my kids, there are many people who would probably say that I was center right, as you might say. I was on the restrictive side, not too restrictive, but pretty restrictive by like general standards. And there's a reason that's the place that my wife and I have fallen and we think is right for this stage. But there will come a day when we'll have to welcome our kids into adulthood more and maturity. And that happens in stages. And I think Sean has a good idea for that as well. So it doesn't look like what we'd think of as retreat. It looks more like retrenchment. And like Dale Alquist said a couple of weeks ago, one of Chesterton's images is the sword and the trowel, which comes from Nehemiah, obviously, in the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And the fact that, you got to be building the wall and the new temple, but Sanballat is out there and he's going to come and attack you and do raids and so forth. He wants to stop you. So you got to have that sword as well. And I think that's a posture we raise our kids in. And sorry that was so long.
No, that's exactly, I think, where we're at. I mean, the reality, I loved your conversation with Sean in so many ways, because there were so many times where you would ask him a question, and you did this as well, but you made it very concrete because you brought it to a conversation. We kind of all can have conversations with our kids. And I think Sean's call for us in this interview is, let's have more conversations, and maybe, I don't know if it's less or more informed consequences for things, right? Like, you can't have your cell phone. Well, let's have actually a conversation about the cell phone. And he mentioned his dad. I've used that so many times, that quote from his dad, rules without relationship leads to rebellion. And I think that there's a structure that we need to build in here that, this is a call to do life with our kids. And I think many times as a parent, that we should almost have an upstream on what is a parent. Because I think as a parent, sometimes we're taught your success as a parent is gauged on how well your kid does in school. If they, don't smoke or do the bad things with other people, do they wear, dress pants to church? And sometimes I think there's even this view of, is parenting seen as a way of salvation almost for your kids, versus what I loved about what Sean did is, we're walking with our kids in this as fellow journeyers, seeing the trappings of the culture ahead and striving to push them upstream to love. So I so appreciated your comments there.
Well, thanks, Wayne. I had this friend, I hope he doesn't mind me telling this story, but he's got a teenage son, and he's sort of helping him navigate through all the issues that come with that. And he is really in just a perfect place for me to watch what he's doing and learn from his experience, because I'm just, this many years behind him with my sons and my daughter, soon to be another daughter. And I see that posture change taking place. I see what you're talking about, where instead of just the guardian, and protector and insulator of innocence, there's a parental moment where you change roles and you're no longer that just protective barrier between the world and your kid, but now you are sort of walking beside them more. You're raising a fellow adult and you're letting them into the complexities of the world and doing what Solomon does in Proverbs and being like, listen, my son, this is what you need to know about the world. This is how you're going to be wise and happy. And these are all the traps and temptations that you have to avoid. And he's doing this with his son, but he's doing it in a way that makes it really clear that he is his son's best advocate and ally. And he is not doing any of this stuff to spoil his fun or manipulate him or live vicariously through him or any of these stupid things. He's doing it because he loves his son and he wants to see the absolute best for him. And he has some wisdom to pass on. That's really the posture that Sean is, I think, obviously advocating, because, he takes his daughter out for coffee to talk about the book that he wrote or to answer a crucial question. And he's even like, okay, after this, we'll buy some shoes, but I want to level with you, because there will be a time when you are, in all respects, except for, the honor of father and daughter, my peer. You will become my equal as an adult, and you must stand beside me and have the training to do this of your own volition, not because I told you so. And that's the posture. That's the whole goal. That's the end result of what we're trying to do with kids. And so that relationship that he talks about, crucial. And I'm still learning how to do that. My oldest is 9, but I have talked to enough wise men and enough wise women who have walked that road and achieved that sort of relationship with their kids that I can say, yes, that is what I'm aiming at right there. I'm trying to be that kind of father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so great. Thanks for this talk, Shane. Appreciate it.
This was good. I appreciate it.